welcome to part 3 of my workshop. A short note first. You can support my work by donating. Donations enable me to produce videos and series of tutorials like this one. And please listen also to those some words at the end and don't just skip them. Thank you. Well, column 1, Dext, DXT, the VST, the user interface. DXT or Dext has got an LFO, of course it has. There are 6 waveforms, including sample and hold, a speed knob for adjusting the LFO's frequency, and 2 knobs named PMD and AMD. These 2 knobs determine the amount of amplitude modulation, AMD, and or pitch modulation, PMD, the LFO sends to the operators. But when I simply turn up these knobs, nothing happens. Neither the amplitude nor the pitch are modulated. That's because there is a kind of, well, let's say, gate between the LFO and the operators. In case of pitch modulation, the gate is called PModSense, pitch modulation sensitivity, which means how sensitive the operators react to the LFO's modulation signal. I open this gate and, wow, here we are. The pitch changes according to the LFO's wave. The amplitude modulation has got such a gate too, but we find it at every individual operator in the operator section. It is called AModSense, amplitude modulation sensitivity. I tune operator 1 and I tune operators 1 and 2 differently and adjust different amplitude modulation sensitivities to demonstrate this. This setup enables me to, for example, modulate the amplitude of the carrier, but not the modulator's amplitude, meaning not changing the sound. Or I can do it the other way and modulate only the modulator's amplitude, meaning only the sound but not the pitch of the sound, not the note I hit on my keyboard. The delay knob in the LFO section adjusts the time between a MIDI note on event, for example by hitting a key, and the beginning of the modulation. The 2 sync switches are self-explanatory. Switching them on, as they are by default, lets the cycles always start anew at phase 0, when a MIDI note on signal reaches the VST. The note on signal resets the LFO and makes it always start new. Switching the synchronization off lets the modulation start at different points in the wave cycle, depending on note length and BMP in relation to the LFO's frequency and the time it has started, because the LFO simply keeps on oscillating without consideration whether there is a note being played or not. In our last workshop, I talked about keyboard level scaling and breakpoints. Let me return to this matter now. We can use this scaling function to produce a kind of keyboard split, kind of. It won't be an abrupt split at a certain note because DX doesn't have such function, but, well, you will see. I want the higher parts of the keyboard to play a simple sine wave to mimic flute-like instruments, whereas the lower part shall be dominated by operator 2 modulating operator 1 with a ratio of 1 to 4. I adjust the breakpoint of operator 2 at about 25, with no effect so far. Now I increase the left depth and the right depth both up to 99. I take care that the depth curve is a linear one. And, well, I get what I wanted. It is, as I told you a minute ago, it's not a split at a certain note, it's rather a fast change within approximately an octave's range. Well, we talked a lot about the VST DX in our last workshop, but we didn't really deal with a lot of FM stuff in general. Column 2, the part about practical FM theory, as I used to call it, is quite short, or was quite short last time. Therefore, and because there has been said nearly everything about the handling of DX by now, I'm going to continue with column 2 now. Our last workshop ended with the question of how to find a helpful system of frequency ratios. As you will remember, let me demonstrate a strange phenomenon first. I choose a carrier frequency of around 2000 Hz, the VST's keyboard shows C5, and modulate it by the same frequency. Operators 1 and 2 show the ratio, it is 2 to 2. And there hasn't happened anything strange so far. Turning up the intensity of the modulation, of the modulating operator, operator 2, lets more and more sidebands occur, well, as expected, so far. I changed the frequency of the modulator to half the frequency of the carrier now. And, hey, the pitch changes suddenly. The pitch. Or in other words, the fundamental frequency changes from that of the carrier to that of the modulator. Let me try an even lower modulation frequency. And again, the fundamental frequency, the pitch of the note, changes with the modulator down to about 500 Hz. Only with extreme intensities this effect is somewhat dimmed. Even if there doesn't seem to be a logical explanation at the first view, we might be satisfied by statements like, okay, the pitch of the note, the fundamental of the sound, equals the lower of both frequencies, no matter whether it is the carrier's or the modulator's frequency. But this would be an absolutely wrong statement. Watch the following examples with the modulator running at a lot of different higher frequencies, resulting in a pitch lower than the frequency of the carrier. time for explanations again. We have to answer the following two questions. At which C to M ratios determines the carrier the pitch of the tone of the sound, which is identical to the question, when is the carrier's frequency the fundamental in the spectrum? And how does this phenomenon and its explanation fit into my scheme of three basic groups of ratios which I introduced in workshop 2? And, well, no, not yet. We will have to, we will have to cope with an awkward surprise a bit later, but let's proceed slowly and nicely, one step after the other. So, at which C to M ratio is the carrier the fundamental, the pitch? We know already that the spacing of the pairs of sidebands is carrier plus modulating frequency and carrier minus modulating frequency. We also know already that the lower sidebands are reflected along the y-axis when C minus modulating frequency makes a negative number. Please watch workshops 1 and 2 if you don't know what I'm talking about. With these two facts in mind, we only need a simple experiment to answer the question of the pitch. Let the red line be the frequency of the carrier. Modulating this carrier with a frequency lower than the carrier's leads to pairs of sidebands on both sides of the carrier. These are the blue ones in the graph. The carrier isn't the fundamental, isn't the lowest frequency anymore. Therefore, the carrier isn't even the pitch of the perceived note or sound anymore. A ratio with the carrier bigger than the modulator doesn't only change the sound, but also the pitch. All right, let's use a modulating frequency of 1.5 the carrier's frequency now. This time the first lower sideband would be negative. It is reflected therefore and ends up between the carrier's frequency and 0. And again, the carrier is not the fundamental, isn't the pitch anymore. Well, you may have got it by now. We need a modulating frequency of at least double the carrier's, or more of course, to let the carrier still determine the pitch, because the first reflected lower sideband must not fall between 0 and the carrier, but at the carrier or above it. Let's take a modulating frequency of about 2.5 the carriers. The first lower sideband would be negative again, but this time reflecting it makes it fall above the carrier's frequency. The carrier's frequency is still the lowest in the spectrum, the carrier is still the fundamental, is still the pitch. The answer to our question and the next rule reads therefore: if we want the carrier of our sound to be the pitch of the sound, the modulator's frequency must be double or more the carrier's frequency. Or both frequencies must be identical, as we saw in the workshops before. Quite clear so far, isn't it? Well, I warned you a minute or two ago that there was going to be an awkward surprise. And here it comes. This 2 times the carrier's frequency rule we have hardly found is unfortunately not very useful in its raw and simple form, because this theory doesn't find itself proved, at least not completely, in real experiments. In experiments, for example, like this one. I choose a pitch, a carrier frequency of 2000 Hz, 2 kHz, and a C/M ratio of 1:6. Then I increase the strength of the modulation by increasing the output level of operator 2, the modulator. The sound changes, well, of course it does, but the pitch doesn't at first. Our newly found rule seems to be valid. But then, as I increase the strength of modulation more and more, the situation changes dramatically. Subfundamental partials occur in the spectrum. The pitch decreases, the pitch isn't that of the carriers anymore. Our nice rule of a modulator's frequency of twice the carriers means the pitch sustains, the pitch is that of the carrier. This wonderful, easy rule is smashed, it's broken into pieces. Let me try another constellation. I choose a pitch of only 1000 Hz and a C/M ratio of 1:10. But increasing the output level of the modulator again leads to the same result. The pitch changes, there are subfundamental frequencies which should not be there if mathematics is still valid on this earth. Well, I suppose mathematics is still valid on this earth. It might be a special problem with the VST-DX then. Okay, let's try other FM VSTs. What about Native Instruments FM8, for example? I choose a C/M ratio of 1:11 this time. The basic pitch, the carrier's frequency, shall still be 1 kHz. Increasing the strength of modulation again shows the same result, subfundamental frequencies. Well, Juhi's Basil then. And again, the pitch decreases, those irregular subfundamental partials occur. What else? Yeah, of course. Image lines citrus. Let's test citrus then. And you will have expected it. Subfundamental irregular partials which don't seem to like mathematics. Well, what's left for testing? Well, yes, perhaps it is a general problem with VSTs. I'm going to make a last attempt to rehabilitate mathematics and take my Korg Volca FM hardware synth. Even if you may expect poor mathematics still sitting in the dark corner of the house of science, crying its eyes out after this hardware test, I'm going to make this last experiment before I will have to go to the same corner to cry a duet together with poor mathematics. And indeed, even with a hardware synth, there are subfundamental partials, subfundamental frequencies, which are contradictory to the mathematics of frequency modulation and phase modulation. But instead of crying a duet, I'm going to follow the tradition of science and do a lot of measuring to find a practical and useful solution to this problem, this phenomenon. A lot of measuring? Well, I mean really a lot. By the way, I'm going to compare all these VSTs and some hardware FM synths more detailed in later parts of this series. Please watch the overview video or visit my website to learn more about the content of future parts of this workshop and about what I'm currently going to work on. But back to our irregular, non-mathematical, illegal, naughty sub-fundamental frequencies. The first series of measurements shows the following principles. First, the higher the basic pitch, the frequency of the carrier, the more likely is the occurrence of those bad partials. And second, the higher the modulator's frequency is above the carrier's frequency, the higher numbers the C to M ratio has, the more likely is the occurrence of those bad partials. And third, did I say two? No, well. Third, the higher the strength of modulation, the output level of the modulator is, the more likely is the occurrence of those bad partials. The results of one of my series of measurements look like that. Or a bit better arranged like that, with the colors representing the number of irregular sub-fundamental frequencies. Or three-dimensional like that, with the height of the pillars representing the number of the sub-fundamental sub-carrier partials. The structure of all these graphs is the same. The x-axis shows the C to M ratio from 1:1 to 1:31. The y-axis shows the basic pitch, the frequency of the carrier, and the corresponding musical note. The number in the upper left corner shows the strength of modulation, the output level of the modulator, here 92, which is the same for the whole graph. I have measured at the following strengths of modulation: 60, 70, 75, 80, 88, 92, and 99. We can easily see how the irregularity increases with increasing strength of modulation. And the same in 3D. I can't help thinking of geological tectonic plates bursting into each other and building up mountains like the Himalaya when I see this. We must not forget that what we are doing right now, We are still refining the system of C to M ratios, and we are still dividing the branch C is smaller than M into different parts with different properties. Right now we are looking for the conditions, looking for C to M ratios, where we can change the sound without changing the pitch. It's clear that we will not find a simple formula for that. In theory it's easy, but the real musical instruments, the VSTs and hardware synths we have to work with, turn out to be real musical instruments with a sometimes different behavior in praxis than they should have according to pure theory. So our task reads now finding a useful rule of the thumb and, desirably, a rule quite independent from a specific VST or hardware synth, quite independent at least. Let me look at the, disturbances at the lower end of the graphs again. For example, at this one, at a modulation strength of 60, a carrier frequency of 750 Hz and a C to M ratio of 1 to 20. The subcarrier frequency here is not at all strong enough. Its amplitude is too low to disturb the perception of a basic pitch of 750 Hz. For practical reasons, we can erase this point from the graph and take it as pitch consistent. Analyzing those lower irregularities, lower according to their position in the graphs, we can eliminate a lot of colored squares from the graphs, and the area of regular behavior of the VSTs and synths expands a bit that way. Doing so with all graphs, meaning at all analyzed modulation strengths and with all the analyzed synths, leads to the following graph, which delivers a scheme showing where to modulate the carrier, where to design the sound without losing the desired and adjusted pitch. The graph is a summary of all of my about 5,000 measurements. It includes the results of all VSTs and synths I have analyzed, therefore, Basil, Citrus, DX, FM8 and Volca FM. In the white area, under the colored lines, there are no irregular sub-fundamental frequencies. In the gray area, there may be such irregular partials. I say maybe because the black, the blue and the red line show worst-case scenarios, meaning if anywhere in the graph any of the VST's synths have shown such a sub-fundamental frequency, it pushes the colored lines down. An example. At a basic frequency of 375 Hz, what is about at F4 sharp, a C to M ratio of 1 to 4 and a modulation strength of 99, image lines Citrus shows one sub-fundamental partial. Therefore, there is a red spot in the graph at these parameters, even if all of the other VSTs behave regular at this point. Every VST and every synth behaves a little bit differently individually. If you need the exact curves of your VST or hardware synth, you will have to do some measurements of your own. But if you need a general secure area, the shown graph will bring you this secure area. Above the black line, you can be quite sure to have subfundamental partials, except with the Volca FM, whose black curve lies a bit higher than the general one you see here. In case you needed, for example, a bunch of high-end partials in the spectrum and you use a high C to M ratio to achieve that, the graph would show you which frequency, which note you should not go beyond in composing your melody. And a second example, how subfundamental partials destroy your melody. But why do those irregular frequencies, which don't seem to know anything about mathematics, which even seem to taunt mathematics, occur at all? Well, that's not a problem of frequency modulation itself, but a problem of coding frequency modulation, a problem of the software part of the synth. It would lead too far away from the matter of this workshop to explain this problem, to explain coding of synths in detail. I'm thinking of starting another workshop parallel to this one in autumn, perhaps in autumn 2017. It would be one about Native Instruments Reactor. There would be the right place for detailed explanations of this phenomenon. But there will be some words about the different strategies the producers of the compared VST synths are obviously following in coding their machines. There will be those words about these strategies in later parts of this series. In these parts, we are going to compare different FM VSTs and synths. All right, let's refine our system of C/M ratios at least. In workshop number 2, we ended with a simple division shown here again. We are in the carrier's frequency is smaller than that of the modulators group and can insert a first subgroup now. The modulator's frequency is twice or higher the carrier's, and the FC-FM-MA relations are in the white area of our graph. All members of this group sustain the pitch of the carrier, the pitch of the note we play. For the sake of completeness, I mention a different situation concerning pitch. I will talk about it later in detail, probably in a later part, as this one is already going to be quite long. The situation I'm thinking of can be described as follows. One of the reflected sidebands, a quite strong one, falls against the carrier's frequency and diminishes its amplitude remarkably. At the same time, there is a huge distance between the carrier's frequency and the first upper sideband, which is strong by definition. In this case, the pitch changes, but not to a lower perceived pitch, but to a higher one, to the pitch of the first sideband. This is not what we have been talking about the last minutes. This is not a kind of irregularity. This is something completely different, and it's regular. But of course it changes the pitch. But don't panic. The situations, or these situations of perceived higher pitch, they are lying far, far, far into the gray area above the colored lines of our graph, number 1. I'm going to explain them nevertheless, but later, as I told you, when I will have to explain the reason for this behavior anyway. Wow! Let me leave the matter of pitch now and turn to another category of C/M ratios and to a special kind of sounds I like to call the sounds of the lonely fundamental, meaning there is a remarkable or even huge distance between the pitch, the fundamental, and the next higher partial. In sounds like these, you get more and more the impression of two notes, of two tones, well, of two pitches played together. If you need something melodic, you have to take care that the distance D is a harmonic interval, for example 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 octaves. Okay, let's talk about octaves then. 1 octave up means twice the frequency. If we want the distance D to be an octave, the first partial has to be twice the carrier. But the first upper sideband is not the modulator's frequency, as I can show you easily. We know it already since workshop 1. A C/M ratio of 1 to 2 leads to a square wave-like sound with every second harmonic missing. We know and see again in the spectrum that the distance D between the fundamental and the first upper sideband is bigger than an octave, It is C plus M. What is 125 Hz plus 250 Hz? That equals 375 Hz, and not 250 Hz, an octave above the carrier. The first lower sideband is C minus M, what is minus 125 Hz and falls against the fundamental. No way to get a distance of an octave with C to M at 1 to 2. Well, the distance of an octave isn't really what I would call the sound of the lonely fundamental, but let me go on to get the principles clear. What if I tried a ratio of 1 to 3? And, hey, look out, here it is, our distance of 1 octave. Though C plus M is not an octave from C, but the positive value of C minus M is an octave. The first lower sideband is reflected into the interval of an octave. If I want the distance d between the carrier as the fundamental and the first upper partial to be an octave, I have to choose a C to M ratio of 1 to 3. Well, I want a bigger distance. I want 2 octaves. 2 octaves higher than the carrier fundamental means 4 times the carrier's frequency. Let me try a C to M ratio of 1 to 4 then. And again, disappointment. I wanted the first upper partial at 4 times 125 Hz, what is 500 Hz. 2 octaves from 125 Hz, but, well, you see what I have really got. The first upper sideband is, of course, C plus M, what is more than 2 octaves from the fundamental, and the first upper partial is the reflected first lower sideband, what is less than 2 octaves distance from the fundamental, from the carrier. You may have understood it by now. It is not the difference between the carrier and the modulator what we have to calculate, but the difference between the carrier and the first reflected lower sideband if we want a distance d of a certain interval here of octaves. Let's look at the relation between the first reflected lower sideband and the first upper sideband then, to come to a formula for the needed C to M ratio. The graph shows that the difference between the frequency of the first upper sideband and the frequency of the reflected first lower sideband is exactly twice the carrier's frequency. In other words, the modulator's frequency has to be the wanted interval plus once the carrier's frequency. Expressing it in a more formal way, and to all of the haters of mathematics, it is still only plus and minus, it looks like that. Our wanted interval plus twice the frequency of C equals the sum of the frequencies of C and M. Subtracting 1C on both sides of the equation gives us the value for the modulator, wanted interval plus 1C. The needed ratio for octaves reads therefore C to factor according to number of octaves plus 1, or C to M equals C to factor plus 1 times C, with factor equals 2 for 1 octave, 4 for 2 octaves, 8 for 3 octaves, and 16 for 4 octaves. It doesn't make a point to calculate distances of more than 4 octaves between the fundamental and the first upper partial, because the majority of the partials would fall above the limit of audibility. And what's more, we would need a ratio of 1 to 33, which is above the possibilities of most of the FM VSTs and FM synths. Let's make a test. I want a lonely fundamental carrier and a first upper partial at a distance of 4 octaves. Therefore, I choose a ratio of 1 to 17. And here we are, the distance is exactly 4 octaves, the carrier is lonely by 4 octaves. Well, a neat and handy formula, but do you remember some minutes ago when we were talking about pitch? We got a neat and handy formula in theory, but the praxis of real existing synths and VSTs showed us a different word. Different world, of course. Well, we can keep cool, as the C to M ratios concerning only lonely fundamental are a subgroup of the M is twice C or bigger group we found before. There are no new artifacts or irregularities. Okay, we can refine our system now and add the subgroup to the list. But wait a minute. It seems to me that the formula we found is a bit more powerful than I thought at the beginning. Let me try it calculating any distance between the fundamental and the first upper partial, any distance I want. And I'm not going to limit my longing for any kind of interval to only the typical ones like fifths or thirds or whatever. Let's say I want the first upper partial to be 10% higher in frequency than the fundamental. Therefore, I try C to M equals C to 1.1 plus 1 times C. What is C to M equals C to 2.1 times C, or M equals 2.1 times C. As I don't allow decimals, I transfer the ratio of 1 to 2.1 to the ratio of 10 to 21, what is the same relationship. Let me try it. And indeed, it works as expected. All first upper partials are by 10% higher in frequency than the fundamental. Because of the high factor of 10, the carrier's frequency, the pitch of the sound, is relatively high, so I'll have to tune the whole synth down or to use very low keys on my keyboard or low notes in the piano roll. Or, in case of DX and some other FM synths, you leave, at least for a moment, the path of using only integers and set operator 1 to a factor of 1 and operator 2 to a factor of 2.1. Not a clean method, but a handy one. And just by the way, we have discovered another typical group of sounds, those with spectrums in which all partials appear in near pairs. But that shall be a matter of later investigations. We can expand, refine our scheme of ratios by the newly found facts. Let's come to a last aspect of column 2 for today, the aspect of harmonicity, and, to prevent a misconception, the terms harmonic and inharmonic and harmonicity are objective terms and describe how perfectly or how little the partials of a spectrum fall at the harmonics of the natural harmonic series. A spectrum which contains only partials which are part of the harmonic series, even if perhaps not all of them, is called a harmonic spectrum. Harmonic doesn't at all mean something like nice or good or desirable, positive or something like that, and inharmonic doesn't mean the opposite of these terms. Harmonic and inharmonic are just musical terms to describe a special aspect of the spectrum of a sound. Those of you who have forgotten about the natural harmonic series will remember when looking at the shown graph. All harmonics are simply integer multiples of the fundamental, whatever the fundamental may be. All spectra of the ratio carrier to modulator equals carrier to 2 are harmonic ones. The perhaps most famous representative of this class of spectra is C2M equals 1 to 2, which is the ratio and spectra of a square wave as we saw in workshop 1. With all other carrier to 2 ratios, the carrier's frequency is higher than the modulator's, which means that the carrier is not the fundamental anymore. The fundamental is one of the lower sidebands. But nevertheless, are all frequencies integer multiples of that new fundamental? Let me demonstrate and explain this with an example. I choose the ratio of 5 to 2. The carrier's frequency is at about 500 Hz, at 491 Hz to be exact. The modulator's frequency is at those 491 divided by 5 and multiplied with 2, which is 196. I round the decimals up. The first two lower sidebands are at 491 minus 196 equals 295, and at 491 minus 2 times 196, which is 99 Hz, and which is the new fundamental, 99 Hz. All further lower sidebands fall against the upper ones or against the carrier. All partials are integer multiples of the 99 Hz fundamental. By the way, the modulator's frequency itself is not present in this spectrum. Let me show that in a more formal way. With a ratio of 5 to 2, we have the following sidebands. Upper sidebands 7, 9, 11, and so on. Lower sidebands 3, 1, minus 1 back to plus 1, minus 3 back to plus 3, minus 5 back to plus 5, minus 7 back to plus 7, minus 9 back to plus 9, minus 11 back to plus 11, and so on. Well, let's think about that for a second. If the modulator's factor in the ratio is 2, the lowest not reflected sideband, which is the fundamental, will always be 1 if the carrier's factor is an odd number, or 2 if the carrier's factor is an even number. And now the revolutionary and wonderful awareness: every integer is a multiple of 1. And every integer is a multiple of 2 when we simply add another 2. 2 and another 2, and so on and so on. And if all negative lower sidebands fall against the positive ones, well, then we get a harmonic spectrum, of course. But hey, wait a minute. Every integer is a multiple of the number 1. And all sidebands are simply the series of the addition and the difference of carrier and modulator. Well, then every ratio in which carrier and modulator differ by 1 must deliver a harmonic spectrum as well. For example, 7 to 6, lower sidebands, 7 minus 6 equals 1. 1 is the lowest partial. Every higher partial is, by definition, a multiple of 1. Let's test it. Okay, it's proved. And the other way, when the modulator occupies the bigger number? Well, it's the same principle. For example, 3 to 4. The lowest partial in the spectrum is, of course, 1 again. 3 minus 4 equals minus 1, which is reflected to plus 1. And again the test. All right, again, it's proved. We have found 3 groups of ratios which deliver harmonic spectra, completely harmonic, as I'm tempted to say, because all partials are part of the harmonic series. These groups are carrier to 2 and carrier to carrier plus 1 and carrier plus 1 to carrier. Or in other words, modulator equals 2 and modulator equals carrier plus 1 and modulator equals carrier minus 1. It's time for the next refinement of our overall scheme of ratios. It is clear, I think, that in the main group of modulator is bigger than the carrier, there is only one member with a modulator having the factor 2, and that is the ratio 1 to 2, which is the square wave. It is also clear, I think, that in the main group of modulator equals carrier, there is only one member with a modulator having the factor 2, and that is the ratio 2 to 2, which is the same as 1 to 1, and which is the Saar wave. Of both waves we know about their harmonic character. We don't have to bother our scheme with that, their form. The new subgroup with modulator equals carrier plus 1 belongs, of course, to the main group modulator is bigger than the carrier, and the new subgroup modulator equals carrier minus 1 belongs to the main group carrier is bigger than modulator. Other ratios delivering perfect harmonic spectra don't exist. But there is a huge range between being perfectly harmonic and, let me say, absolutely inharmonic. We have to investigate this range now and find a kind of scale of harmonicity. Finding such a scale seems to be an easy task, because the more partials are part of the harmonic series, which means the more partials are integer multiples of the fundamental, and preferably without too many or too large gaps in the harmonic series, the more this spectrum is a harmonic one. Well then, but at which ratios are many of the partials integer multiples of the fundamental, and at which ratios aren't they? 2 examples first. With a ratio of C to M equals 3 to 2, we get a harmonic spectrum. Well, the carrier is not the fundamental, but all partials are multiples, integer multiples, of the lower sideband, which is the fundamental. Now another ratio, 7 to 9. Here we get a quite inharmonic spectrum. I want to make it short. You will find, after some experiments, that the number of harmonic partials in an FM spectrum decreases with an increasing LCM, an increasing lowest common multiple of carrier and modulator. Some examples. In the ratio 1 to 1, the LCM is 1, of course, and identical with the carrier and the modulator. The spectrum is perfectly harmonic. It's a Saar wave. In the ratio 1 to 2, the LCM is 2 and identical to one of the factors, the modulator, and the spectrum is completely harmonic as well, just some harmonics are missing. It's a square wave. In the ratio of 7 to 9 of our last experiment, the LCM is fairly high. It is 63. The spectrum is quite inharmonic. But again, wait a minute. What is about ratios like, for example, 7 to 8? The LCM is also quite high, it is 56, but the spectrum is harmonic. M equals C plus 1, it is one of our last harmonic subgroups. Well, we see that our LCM rule is a subordinate one. Our groups go first, then comes the LCM rule. But, and it is a very big but, if we talk about more subjective perception and don't strictly look at the frequencies but listen more to the sound, our LCM rule gets back a bit of its importance, even in the harmonic subgroups of our system of ratios, as, for example, the ratio 7 to 8 produces a harmonic spectrum which sounds at least a bit inharmonic. That is because of the huge distance between the fundamental and the first upper partials and the near pairwise organization of the bunch of the partials. We could spend hours on discussing objective and individual subjective harmonicity, but, all right, let that be enough of column 2 for today's workshop. Enough, but for the next and further refinement of our system of ratios. Or, well, no. I won't add this LCM thing to our system of ratios because it fits in any of those groups of ratios. I'd rather call it a rule, and so here is rule number 4. The higher the LCM of the factors of a ratio is, the more we perceive the resulting sound as inharmonic, whether it is really inharmonic, because its partials don't belong to the harmonic series of the fundamental, or whether our subjective perception makes it inharmonic because of the inhomogeneous structure of its harmonic partials. And with that said, we have reached at least column 3 of this workshop again. I want to spend some time on one of Brian Eno's DX7 patches now. The patch I want to talk about today is called Violin 3. It was first published in an old issue of the magazine Keyboard. It was in 1987. Before I start with the analysis, I'd like to demonstrate how multicolored, how complex and how sophisticated this patch, this sound is. Depending on the length of the notes, as well as on the velocity of the keystrokes and the octave, the pitch of the note, the instrument sounds differently. There are some nice details as well, for example the sound when the bow touches the string, which sounds even different with different pitches. Some examples. First, I play the same note at the same low velocity at a mid-range frequency and make it gradually longer and longer to demonstrate how the vibrato-like effect of pressing the finger on the string comes in. And please notice also the sound of the bow touching the string at the beginning of each note. Second, the same but with a higher velocity this time. Third, now a lower frequency. Again, I apply a quite low velocity first. Fourth, the same with a higher velocity. Fifth, higher notes now, low velocity first. Sixth, and with higher velocity. Seventh, I play the same length of the note now, but I gradually increase the velocity, a high note at first. Eight, the same at a lower frequency. Nine, and the last at a deep frequency. All right, but now for the analysis. The algorithm 17 consists of 3 parallel chains of modulators which modulate a single carrier. The leftmost chain contains only operator 2 but includes a feedback loop. The chain in the middle consists of operator 4 modulating operator 3, which then modulates the carrier operator 1. And the right chain consists of operator 6 modulating operator 5, which modulates the carrier. Let's have a quick look at the LFO section. We see that the depth of the pitch modulation PMD is set to 0, therefore there isn't any pitch modulation by the LFO. The depth of the amplitude modulation AMD is at maximum, but the amplitude modulation sensitivity of each operator is set to 0. Therefore, there isn't even an amplitude modulation caused by the LFO. In short, the LFO is not used in this preset. I switch operators 2, 3 and 5 off to look at the envelope and scaling settings of the carrier of operator 1. With envelope rate 1 at 42, there is a short attack to the whole sound, followed by a very long first decay from level 99 down to level 90, followed by a rise up to 97. The envelope ends with a medium-long release. This course of the volume conforms to that of a stroke of the violin bow, with a slowly decreasing volume at the quite abrupt little increase at the end of a long stroke, whereas shorter and shortest strokes don't show remarkable changes of the volume. How fast the sound hikes through the whole envelope depends on the MIDI note number or on the key I hit on the keyboard, because the rate scaling is not 0 but 1, meaning that lower notes need more time to go through the whole envelope, whereas higher notes manage to get through faster. With a rate scaling of 1, the difference is still quite moderate, though. There is no level scaling. Left and right depth are 0, but the velocity sensitivity of the carrier's output is at 4, an upper middle value, which puts some remarkable expression to the playing of the keyboard. Well, let's activate the left modulation chain and switch on operator 2 again. The carrier to modulator ratio is about 2 to 6, what is 1 to 3. Well, where do we have this ratio to sort in? Where in our system of ratios from column 2 does it belong? First of all, I'd like to remind you that what we said about the 1 to 2 ratio and the missing of every second harmonic in the spectrum of a square wave, here we have the ratio of 1 to 3. And, of course, compared to the spectrum of a complete series of harmonics, as we would find it with a Saw wave, every third harmonic is missing. But now for our system of ratios. The modulator's frequency is more than twice the carrier's, and with a factor of 3 or 6 in relation to a carrier of 2, we are well in the wide area of graph number 1. Therefore, the carrier's frequency sustains as the fundamental of the sound. The difference between the carrier and the first upper sideband is, of course, 1 octave. First, because M equals 3, and second, because the octave is the first upper harmonic in a full harmonic spectrum, and we discovered that every third, not every second, harmonic is missing. And rule number 4, saying that the higher the LCM of the factors of a ratio is, the more we perceive the sound as inharmonic. Well, the LCM of 1 and 3 is 3, really low a number, and again, of course, the sound is harmonic. Okay, both operators are slightly detuned, not enough to change the character of the sound. Plus and minus 1 is really a very small amount of detuning. You won't really hear it as a single factor. But the detuning is sufficient to bring a small heterodyne beat to the sound, still not sensational but noticeable. You may have already got a notion of a principle making good patches with frequency modulation. It's the adding together of a number of small, mainly less than spectacular, changes and adjustments that makes the sound a huge sound. And also, my next matter is, as a single and individual aspect, far from being spectacular, the feedback of operator 2. Adjusted to a value of 5, the feedback changes the higher part of the spectrum only a little. And it doesn't really emphasize the higher partials, but change its structure by distributing the energy differently from the sound without feedback. The two spectra show what I am talking about. I increase the feedback to a value of 7 to show what feedback causes a bit better noticeable. The modulation envelope of operator 2, it is the red one in the graph, starts with a shorter attack than that of the carrier operator 1 and decreases fast but only a little from level 99 back to level 96, from where it decreases very slowly down to 89. The envelopes are quite similar. The modulation caused by operator 2 is, but for the very beginning of the sound, more or less constant. The fact that the decrease during rate 3 starts earlier than that of operator 2 during its rate 2 causes a kind of small, very small shimmer effect. The whole envelope is, well, let me say faster, with higher notes than the envelope of operator 1, because the rate scaling is 3 times stronger. Operator 1 has a rate scaling of 1, operator 2 has a rate scaling of 3. The scaling depth of the output level is, as with operator 1, adjusted to 0, no level scaling at all. And the key velocity is less than that of the carriers. All in all, we can say that the modulation caused by operator 2 doesn't change a lot during a node. And it doesn't depend a lot on the velocity and doesn't depend at all on the velocity of a keystroke. Well, so far the left modulation chain with operator 2 and feedback. Switching operator 2 off and operator 3 on leads us to the modulation chain in the middle with operators 3 and 4. Well, the first obvious and basic difference to everything we said before is the fact that we have two modulators here, two modulators connected in series. The carrier is modulated by the result of the modulation of operator 3 by operator 4. We have not talked about these modulations in series in column 2 yet, and I'm not going to talk about it in detail today because it's too complex a thing to be dealt with just by the way. The next workshop, workshop 4, is going to deal with this matter in detail. But for today's analysis, it's sufficient to find out how operator 4 basically changes the sound. Well, let's compare the spectrum with and without operator 4 then. And the same with a lower note. We see that operator 4 fills in the harmonics which are missing in the pure modulation by the carrier by only operator 3. Additionally, or better said, by doing so, it emphasizes the higher parts of the spectrum. It's a pretty bit more complex, really, but these poor explanations shall and will be enough for today's understanding of the patch, not least thanks to the quite moderate output level of operator 4, which is at only 59. The C/M ratio of operators 1 and 3 without activating operator 4 is 2:8 or 1:4. We get a kind of squarish wave with every second harmonic missing. And of course it is a harmonic spectrum with an LCM identical to one of the factors. The fundamental is still identical with the carrier's frequency. The spectrum of the ratio 1:4 resembles the spectrum of a typical square wave ratio of 1:2, but for the range of frequencies in the spectrum. Remembering the C/M ratio of operator 1 and operator 2 in the left modulation chain, which is 1:3, we have both of the lowest non-SAW harmonical ratios, 1:3 and 1:2, in this patch. We have already discovered that operator 4 fills these gaps between the harmonics, fills in the missing frequencies to get a full harmonic spectrum, what is nothing else than a SAW wave-like spectrum. Therefore, I want to look at the envelopes and the level and rate scaling settings of operators 4 and 3 at first, because I want to know how, according to these settings, the character of the sound changes from square to SAW. We see that operator 4, the second order modulator, steps in quite fast and its modulation strength goes up to maximum. After both operators decrease by a small amount, operator 3 only by 1 point, the second order modulator, what is operator 4, decreases its output and modulation faster than operator 3, so that the saw-like character of the sound vanishes, and in the end we hear only the modulation caused by operator 3, the main modulator of the chain. But there is more about the modulation levels than only the envelope. The rate scaling value of operator 4 is at a high number, at 6. Therefore, the stages of its envelope go by remarkably faster with higher keys than with lower keys. The rate scaling of operator 3 is at an average amount at 3 only. What about the level scaling, the scaling of the operator's output? Well, even with the scaling of the overall output of the operators, it is the same. Operator 4 reduces the level of its output remarkably, going above the breakpoint of A3, whereas operator 3 reduces the general modulation strength of the middle chain only slightly above above the breakpoint of F2. The key velocity of the operators is 2 with operator 3 and 0 with operator 4, meaning there is a bit of expressiveness concerning the whole modulation of the middle chain, but no influence on the second order modulator on operator 4. Well, so far the modulation chain in the middle. Let's go to the right one, to operators 5 and 6. I switch operator 3 off and operator 5 on. One could think that without operators 4 and 6, the effect of the modulation by operator 5 should be similar to that of operator 3, as both ratios are similarly nearly 2:8. But operator 3 modulating the carrier, operator 1, sounds quite different from operator 5 modulating the carrier. Let's find out why. Is it that small detuning thing? No, it isn't. Is it the difference in key velocity? No, it isn't either. Is it the level scaling? No, it isn't. Well, it can't be the level scaling, as the note we hear is below the breakpoint, and there is no difference in the left depth between operator 3 and operator 5. Well, the only thing left is the envelope. Let's compare the two envelopes then. And yes, we see that simply the strength of modulation of operator 5 decreases fast and operates below that of operator 3 all the time. To prove that this really makes the difference we are talking about, I could adjust the envelope of operator 5 similarly to that of operator 3. Well, boring. I increase instead level 3 of operator 5 and voila, the sound changes and gets that of operator 3 modulating the carrier. What's left to mention? Well, the ratio of about 2 to 8 carrier to modulator leads, of course, to a harmonic spectrum, and the fundamental is the carrier's frequency. And what else? Yes, the rate scaling is low at an amount of only 1, and there is no level scaling depth at all, neither is there any key velocity sensitivity. Okay. Let's go on and talk about the second order modulator of this chain. Let's talk about operator 6. Comparing the spectra with and without operator 6, we get what we already know from the pair operator 3 and operator 4. The second order operator 6 fills in the missing harmonics and expands the spectrum up to higher frequencies. But there it is, there in the region of the higher frequencies, where we discover irregularities, for example, suspicious gaps at the high end. But these phenomena shall be talked about in the column 2 of the next workshop. The filling of the missing harmonics, the extending of the spectrum, and the change of the amplitudes of the partials from operator 5, all that is caused by operator 6 and brings, well, brilliance, adds this silvery brilliant touch to the sound. The second order modulator of the modulation chain in the middle, operator 4, runs at a frequency factor of 6, whereas operator 6 is adjusted to 10. I want to talk about some frequency effects of operator 6, therefore. At first, as it is, a frequency factor of 10. Now I reduce the frequency of operator 6 down to 6 to resemble the middle chain a bit. We see there are some changes in the amplitudes of the partials, and, the most obvious difference, with a higher modulation frequency the sound expands to higher partials. Well, not very exciting so far. I choose an even higher frequency of operator 6 now, but still use an even factor to get a low LCM and a harmonic sound. We see that the tendency we observed with the factors of 6 and 10 continues and is very obvious now. The sound still contains harmonic partials, but the gaps we discovered with the factor of 10 are more expressive and have grown into a grouping of the higher partials. And, of course, the spectrum has once again expanded at the higher end. I can't help trying some odd frequency factors for this second order modulator and therefore leaving the region of pure harmonic spectra and even of a sustained fundamental. All right, envelope and rates again. It's obvious that the second order modulation here in this right chain develops differently from that in the middle chain. Levels 1, 2, and 3 are 99, 99, and 97, in other words, at maximum. Therefore, the rates 2 and 3 are not very important, as there are no different levels to climb up to or to decrease down from. The attack of 73, rate 1, is only a little bit different from the attack of operator 5 with its 67. The second order modulation stays the same as long as a key is pressed. The release to 0 is adjusted at a rate of 0, the same as the release of the main modulator, operator 5. Even though the release phase, therefore, both modulators go, even through the release phase, therefore, both modulators go parallel. The partials filled in by operator 6 and the partials generated by the main modulator operator 5 are in accord with each other. There are different rate scalings, 1 with operator 5 and 3 with operator 6, but as the levels of operator 6 stay more or less the same, as told, the speed of going through the envelope doesn't really matter a lot. The level scaling is different and matters. The second order modulation is weaker with higher notes than with lower ones. Thank you for watching. There is a website of mine at www.rofil-media.net where you will find more information about this series of tutorials. You will also find an overview about all things I'm currently working on there, including all 4 of my YouTube channels. There is also a forum there, the Deep Sound Divers Coffee House, where you can discuss my videos. This new version of the Deep Sound Divers Coffee House provides a new service. You can now jump directly to that point in the video you want to watch again. That gives you, combined with the general search functions of the forum, a quite powerful and efficient way of searching for certain matters in the tutorials and workshops, of course. The Deep Sound Divers Coffee House is getting more and more a comprehensive video manual of the discussed VSTs and synths that way. Please consider liking, sharing and subscribing. And if you really like this video, please think about donating a little to help me making more videos like this one. Have a great day and a good time. Rolf.